Hey, coordination. On today's episode of GreenPilled, we have Matt Prewitt from the RadicalxChange Foundation. Matt's the president of the RadicalxChange Foundation. He's a research partner at Amentum, which is a crypto-focused fund, and is thinking a lot about power concentration in the world. Matt has a background as a litigator and is now working in the RadicalxChange movement and on Web3 type mechanisms in order to leverage radical markets, using markets in new places to create more pluralism in the world. So Matt's just this incredibly lucid thinker, and we go really deep on some of the ideas in the radical markets movement and the RadicalxChange movement, primarily quadratic voting, which is a special place in my heart because Gitcoin grants is built on top of quadratic voting. And then we also go deep on Harberger taxes. So if you're into those mechanisms, if you're into using markets in new places, then this episode is for you. Coordination. Without further ado, I give you Matt Prewitt, the president of the RadicalxChange Foundation.
Immutable X is the layer 2 platform for crypto gaming. Immutable offers massive scalability with up to 9,000 transactions per second and instant transaction confirmation. No more gas fees, no more waiting around for your transaction to clear. Immutable's zero knowledge rollup finally unlocks the world of crypto gaming. Immutable X is the only gas-free NFT minting platform with over 26 million NFTs minted, all with zero gas fees. With the power of Immutable, gaming developers don't also need to become smart contract developers. They just need to plug in to Immutable's API and instantly start unlocking the full potential of crypto assets inside of games. This is why world-class companies and projects have decided to deploy on Immutable X, like GameStop, Ember Sword, Planet Quest, Illuvium, TikTok, and many more behind the scenes. So start building your game on Immutable X today at immutable.com. COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses who need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage their treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the extremely secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasuries to expressive, flexible, multi-chain features such as global user management, global contracts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization. COINSHIFT layers on powerful treasury management tools on top of the proven security of Gnosis Safe, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Messari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. In DeFi, you have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless.
Hey, Matt, what's up?
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks. So great to have you. Can you tell us how you got involved in RadicalxChange and what RadicalxChange is?
Sure. RadicalxChange is a nonprofit that coordinates a global network of people who are interested in making the institutions of democracy and markets better. And we've been sort of I would say a crypto adjacent sort of civil society organization since we started up in 2018. I can say a little bit more about RadicalxChange in a minute, but how did I get here? I think unlike a lot of people who found their way to RadicalxChange over the years, crypto was actually like my path to it. So before I was doing what I'm doing now, I was a antitrust litigator. I was a practicing lawyer for most of the 2010s, and I was basically doing like plaintiff side antitrust work. And so the way I sort of describe my career arc is I've been thinking about the problem of power concentration for a long time, and I was initially thinking about it through the lens of law. But I've also always been interested in technology. Grew up in the Bay Area and sort of have watched the multiple waves of technology business stuff. And at some point, I basically kind of got disillusioned with my ability to like litigate away the kinds of problems that antitrust law is supposed to solve, and started thinking about how to kind of get into the next wave of new technologies to use that to create more enduringly, interestingly distributed power structures. That, and Ethereum caught my eye in 2015, and I basically just got really, really interested in a lot of what you and others have been thinking about for many years now, which is how to use this technology to build distributed power structures. I sort of quickly realized, I expressed that interest basically by trying to build little things and trying to sort of instantiate different sorts of decision-making systems and stuff with smart contracts. And through that kind of exercise, realized that in order to make this work, in order to build the kind of distributed power structure that is like the exciting possibility here, we were going to need a better understanding of mechanism design. We were going to need to get the whole, get the incentives right in great detail with great sophistication. So I plunged down the hole of mechanism design, the rabbit hole of mechanism design, and found the work of Glenn Weil, who's an economist who's been doing lots of interesting work on voting systems and much more, as you know, for many years, and got in touch with Glenn. Realized that we were interested in a lot of the same things, a lot of the same kind of ideas for the direction of technology and politics, and started RadicalxChange Foundation in the wake of the book Radical Markets coming out in 2018 to sort of rally some of the energy that book had unleashed around people who are interested in sort of like reforming political economy.
Right. So that arc, it sounds like you kind of went from litigating the kind of problems that you're interested in creating a dent in the universe for, to creating markets for solving for those kind of problems. Is that a good summary, or would you push back on that at all?
I would push back on that a bit. I think that I kind of view the I like to think of both democratic systems and markets as instances of a larger category of thing, which is basically like collective decision systems, or just kind of like scaled systems through which people work together and deal with complexity. So I think that the dichotomy between like democracy and markets is partly real and partly false. There are meaningful distinctions that people are pointing to when they make that distinction, but at the same time, there are ways in which both are trying to do the same thing. So, yeah, I would complicate the distinction.
Okay, great. Well, I should note that I feel a deep alignment between RadicalxChange and Gitcoin. Gitcoin is built on top of Gitcoin Grants, which is built on top of Quadratic Funding, which is actually a fork, derivative of an idea coming out of Radical Markets. So I'd say that we're bringing some of the Web3 developers to the dance, and y'all are bringing some of the mechanism design to the dance, and just feel deep reverence for RadicalxChange and the movement. Because of that. Can you tell us about the movement? I mean, I guess I'd love to hear about the RadicalxChange movement, but also the primary mechanisms and themes that y'all promote.
Sure. So there are RadicalxChange chapters around the world, which are groups of people who get together to talk about the sorts of ideas that we work on and the sort of subject matter of mechanism design and democracy and plurality and pluralism and all the kind of stuff that we'll get into a little bit more. But there's a really interesting sort of multidisciplinary, open network of people around the world who are into this, and which we support and facilitate through RadicalxChange Foundation. And this can mean like meetup groups and discussions and professional networks, or it can mean bringing these ideas to local politics, or bringing these ideas to the organizations that we work in. And when I say these ideas, so like, all right, what is it? What are we talking about? So the book Radical Markets had had a couple sort of banner concepts in it, which we've really built upon and moved beyond in many ways. But I think it's still kind of useful to understand these two things to get the DNA of RadicalxChange Foundation and RadicalxChange in general. And the first one is a voting system called Quadratic Voting, and the second one is a plural property system or a partial common property system, or basically a way of like better sharing property that we has. There are many sort of variations on it, which all have their own names, but we often call it SALSA, which means self-assessed licenses sold at auction. Sometimes we call it in the book Radical Markets, it's called cost, and as you mentioned, it's also called another label for this general family of ideas is Harberger taxation, and yeah, as I was mentioning, like so, this is a way of essentially rethinking property, like transcending private property, moving beyond private property, coming up with better ways of figuring out who within a community should have the kind of possessory interest to a piece of property, and where the benefits of that property should flow. Maybe they shouldn't. In other words, maybe those benefits can be more widely distributed than only going to like the quote unquote owner. So this is the kind of thrust of this way of thinking about property. And quadratic voting is a better way of making group decisions that I can talk more about. But well, I'll pause there. Those are the sorts of that gives a flavor for how our work is addressing both sides of this democracy markets constellation.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I think that what's so interesting is this is the heart of what we're doing in the Web3 space, is the intersection of mechanism design and markets and collective decision making. And I think that y'all are kind of on the forefront of that. So I guess I'm wondering, should we go deep on some of those mechanisms? I think we could go deep on SALSA. We could go deep on quadratic funding and why those are important, or we could talk about the values that we're trying to evoke when we design these systems. Kind of choose your own adventure. What do you want to say next?
Let's go a little deeper on quadratic voting and SALSA. I think it's kind of useful to have both of those in mind and go from there.
Totally, yeah.
So
sounds good. Let's start with quadratic voting then.
Yeah. So the way to think about quadratic voting is it's just a way of making a decision better. It's a way of like restructuring a voting process and a ballot. And the way that it works is pretty straightforward. It's that you have if you can imagine that we're making a decision on a range of issues on a ballot, instead of everybody just voting sort of once on each issue on the ballot, we might instead have a budget of like voice credits that we can allocate between the different issues to indicate how strongly we care about the different issues. So if you care more about one issue on the ballot, you can put more voice credits on it and effectively vote more times on it. But the relationship between the amount of voice credits you allocate to it and the number of like counted votes on it is quadratic, is not a simple linear relationship. So this is how it works. It's if you want to vote on something once, you allocate 1 voice credit to it. If you want to vote on something twice, you allocate 4 voice credits to it. If you want to vote on something 3 times, you allocate 9 voice credits to it. So it's fairly simple twist on like a system that allows you to a fairly simple twist on multiple voting, basically, that lets you express stronger or weaker opinions. And what it does, the interesting thing about it is that while it lets you express a stronger point of view on issues that you care about more strongly, it in effect imposes a very high cost for doing so. because if you decide to vote 3 times on something, that costs you 9 voting credits, which means that, that you could have just voted on it once for 1 voting credit. Instead, you chose to vote 3 times. That cost you 8 more, which you could have allocated to other issues. So you have sort of like way less say on all of the other issues if you decide to express a strong point of view on any particular issue. Why is that a big idea? That's a bigger idea than it might seem at first. The reason it's such a big idea is that it allows voting systems to take in information about how strongly people care about different issues without encouraging them to express a very, very strong point of view on every single issue. So it kind of puts into balance the incentive to just yell at the top of your lungs with the interest of giving everybody an equal say. And it's basically like, you can sort of think of it as causing each voter to like internalize the negative externality of trying to yell louder than other voters. And by putting these different incentives like in balance, the idea is that it's incentivizing people to be honest about how strongly they care. So that you're not like the idea behind it is that it's not encouraging you to think strategically or to like game a system. It's actually, the incentives are set up so that the way to interact with quadratic voting is just to think honestly and seriously about how much you care about the different issues relative to one another and express that, instead of like, trying to,
Right.
manipulate the outcome by going all in on something and sacrificing other things. You really just want to like just be honest about how much you care.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you and I have talked about before is how to take democracy and bring it into higher resolution, or like high bandwidth democracy. And what I love about what we're talking about here is that I think about, we're not just expressing the direction of our preferences, but we're also just expressing the degree of our preferences, which to me that maps as like higher resolution input into a democratic system. The ability to map how much you care about each item seems like an innovation to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, Audrey Tong has talked about this and used the metaphor of bandwidth for democracy to great effect, and which I love, right? That the way that we traditionally vote is super, super low bandwidth. We send like a couple bits of information every couple of years. And it's fairly understandable that if that's the only means of expression that democratic systems are taking in, either people are going to feel that they don't matter, people are going to be disenfranchised, people are going to get frustrated and disillusioned with the process, or our efforts to influence the democratic, system are going to spill over into other areas of life. So taking in more information through now there's a lot to be said about, deliberation and stuff like that too, which is, you need to have a healthy deliberation process to lead into a healthy voting decision process, right? And you never want the voting and the decision to displace the deliberation and the kind of question structuring. But sometimes you need to get down to brass tacks and make a complicated decision, and having the best possible tools to do that is a way of keeping democracy healthy. So that's what inspires me about it too. I mean, this is a way of bringing forward institutional processes that enable everyone to have a say, and hopefully like basically keeping democracy vital in all different areas of life, not only in government but in all of the other spaces where democratic decision making has an important role to play.
Right. So this is actually the mechanism that Gitcoin is built on top of. Gitcoin grants, we have a matching campaign every quarter, and we match contributions from the crowd, and we use quadratic funding in order to do that. Quadratic funding is just an implementation of quadratic voting, where the voice credits are actually the dollars or the tokens that you spend. And I think it's just really neat to think about the evolution of quadratic voting to quadratic funding and how they're sort of complementary to each other. I don't know if you have anything to say about quadratic funding, but I just wanted to connect to the audience that that's something that we're deeply connected to at Gitcoin.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, quadratic funding is a basically an implementation or a instantiation of quadratic voting in which the donations are like a form of voting, and it's an incredibly powerful way of funding public goods, which is another really, really deep issue in the structure of democracies. And I think the evolution of quadratic voting into quadratic funding, or the sort of development of the idea into that new space, is a really powerful thing and an example of how this thing of quadratic voting kind of taps into a very deep pattern in how we could better structure our institutions, which is that we could devise mechanisms where our expression of power internalizes the externalities that it imposes on others, right? And I mean, that's what quadratic voting is. That's what quadratic voting does. And by devising systems that do that, we can make systems that are higher bandwidth. We can make systems that have a higher informational throughput, that have take in more dimensions of information from people, and let us scale, let us function together as a society without collapsing into autocracies or other non-democratic forms, which we sometimes collapse into when we try to scale without the right tools. So,
yeah, I think it's a really beautiful mechanism, and I just am very thankful to be locked in this. I'll call it a dance between RadicalxChange and Glenn and you, who are kind of like building some of these mechanisms. And there's a group of us that are more, I'd say, practitioners, people who are taking this and putting it into practice. I'm running a brand called Gitcoin Grants. Actually, I'm not running it anymore. The DAO is running it, but I'm involved. And there's this kind of like this loop between theory and action, experiments, and then results that kind of loops back from there. And it's just kind of been this very virtuous cycle to be working together on this. So looking forward to continuing to experiment with this mechanism in the future. And I think that we have some ideas that have been coming out in the future about how to make this mechanism more plural. And I'm curious if we want to go into that next. Why is pluralism important? How could we advance this mechanism in the future?
Yeah, there's a so the one of the most exciting things about these sort of institutional innovation ideas is that they sort of open the door to a design space in which our institutions could not only be more democratic, but also sort of more pluralistic, more sort of like local and nested and interpenetrating and interacting, as opposed to speaking kind of impressionistically, moving a little bit away from the sort of monolithic universal power structures into more localized, lower to the ground, complex, interpenetrating, community-based, basically power structures. And I think that, I mean, to me, that tracks a vision of the world that is attractive to me, right? In which different kinds of values are embodied and instantiated and constituted in lots of different democratic communities. And a lot of our recent work is sort of oriented in that direction, oriented in the direction of making things like quadratic voting and Harberger taxes or SALSA or partial common ownership, and quadratic funding and much more, including soul-bound tokens, if we want to get into that. Taking these kinds of governance patterns and institutional ideas and thinking about how they can open the door to a deeply democratic and also diverse and plural and complex structure of different powers that, so I was very abstract, but that's kind of the world that we're trying to build.
Right.
Yeah, I'll pause there. We can pull off.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're gonna have Pooja and Glenn and Leon on the podcast in order to talk about soulbound tokens, decentralized society. I think we'll go deep on that mechanism with them. In fact, maybe I'll drop this episode and that episode together because I think they're deeply complementary. But I just think that this idea of pluralism is really the exciting thing to me. A social philosophy that recognizes and fosters the flourishing of a cooperation of diversity of socio-cultural groups and systems. So basically, it seems like we've kind of got this idea that diversity creates anti-fragility, and this pluralism of different mechanisms is kind of the institutions that we want to build in the 21st century. So I just want to pause and I feel like I'm kind of sipping or wafting a fine wine right here. When we talk about pluralism, we kind of talk about the direction that we want to go there. I don't know if you have anything else to say about pluralism, but I've been reading a lot of Glenn's writing, and I just think it's kind of a beautiful idea.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that there's so much to say about it. One is just that I think that one thing to say about it is you can understand a lot of the difficulties that our societies have faced over the past couple hundred years as related to the problem of kind of shoehorning everybody into one size fits all sort of power structures that often put people pretty far from power, and that assume a very high degree of individuality and don't really provide tools for people to participate in the governance of closer to home type institutions that are really important in life, communities and churches and civil society organizations and all these local government, all these kinds of layers of power and government and connection are really where the action is. They're where the meaning is, and people participating richly and meaningfully in these kinds of power structures is we need that as human beings. We need that as as individuals, and we also need those sorts of institutions to be healthy for the macro society to be healthy. And we've ended up in this place where it's everyone is focused on the same node of power. Everyone's focused on the Supreme Court or the UN or the whatever it may be, right? We're all kind of fighting over the same nodes. And meanwhile, which are important, I'm not saying they aren't, but meanwhile, the other institutions are hollowing out and being eroded, right? People are not as engaged in local government as they probably ought to be. They, civil society, of the kind that, Alexis de Tocqueville eloquently described, is floundering, right? Unions are suffering, right? Unions have just gotten weaker, and unions are a good example, I think, of this kind of mid-level of associative organization. and so there's just a whole sort of like layer of society that is like become a ghost town. And by building better systems of governance and better systems of like sharing property, better systems of collaborating in small and medium-sized groups, and allowing people to commit to communities in new ways and participate in them in richer ways, that that holds the promise of a more pluralistic, healthier society, at the kind of micro level and at the macro level.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think we're in this moment of change in which the way democracy has been conducted in the past is the way it's not going to be in the future. And it just seems to me that we're in this kind of transition from the industrial age to a more information age. And we're looking for these more high resolution digital ways of expressing our signals, and maintaining that loop of the consent of the governed being the only legitimate basis of governance. And I think that it's a moment of great opportunity, but also of great peril. And so that's why it's what gets me up in the morning is working on these democratic systems and trying to experiment with what democracy will look like in the digital age. So I think the key point I take away from the pluralism thing is that by having a pluralism of mechanisms for funding our commons and for civic life in the 21st century, we don't put too much burden on one mechanism, and having a plurality of futures where, say, there's SALSA and there's quadratic voting and there's retroactive public goods funding and probably a dozen other mechanisms that I'm not even aware of, give backs, is kind of that diversity creates an anti-fragility. And so I think there's a big opportunity ahead, and getting involved in the radical exchange movement, I think, is how you get involved in that dance of the creation of those mechanisms and the dreaming of those mechanisms. So you're really at the epicenter of it. I'm curious if you have anything else to say about pluralism. I'd love to dive in on SALSA or Harberger taxes next, but kind of curious where your head's at, Matt.
I mean, well, one thing I'll put a pin in, and then let's talk about SALSA and Harberger taxes, is that
Okay.
one of the kind of like anti-pluralistic influences on society in recent centuries, but also decades in particular, is the influence of basically like the global economy, right? So, I mean, one of these highly universalizing institutions is money, and so building governance institutions that enable people to participate in meaningful community structures and govern essentially, assets and not only assets but norms and things like that in a way that is in ways that are like a little bit like have an umbrella around them vis-a-vis the global economy is really a big piece of this. So
right. So is it that the globalism and the scale being disconnected from local people and their local values is that kind of the crux of it, you think?
That's one way of putting it, and I think another way of putting it is that when everything is fungible into like the same yardstick, be that the dollar or the Bitcoin or the bundle of currencies, when everything can be readily transformed into that, then that one yardstick becomes this sort of the language that everybody has to speak in every different context, and creating local contexts of governance of community institutions or management of assets in which that is not the language that people need to speak is, I think, important to revitalizing our society, like at the deepest level. So, a lot of the things that do still kind of work are things that are are things in which the language of money isn't the sole language spoken, and distributed technologies like blockchain technology and similar and they create a design space which we haven't yet fully occupied, we haven't yet fully explored for creating new kinds of institutions and power structures that don't just run on that don't just speak exactly the same language as every other institution that first and foremost speaks the language of dollars. So yeah, I'm going to give a talk about this in a month or so. Or there's more to say about what I'm thinking about how all this relates to like money and local currency. But so suffice to say, I think there's a huge design space opening up for community currencies and local economics that I'm quite excited about.
Right. Well, I'm really jazzed about that world. If we believe that the globalism and the commodification of everything into this one global money is the problem, then having local community currencies in which you can have your own sort of economy that's based off of your own set of values, then I think that's really a way of creating these. I don't want to use the word bubble because that sounds like it's going to pop, but almost these sort of like safe places where you can have currency that is relative to your own values. And I can see why that would be really powerful in a world in which we've kind of got global values and local values together. So looking forward to that talk and exploring those ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And bubble is, the way I think about it is I kind of like the word membrane. I mean, a bubble is not a bad word necessarily, but it's like, or the other way of thinking about it is like layers of an onion. I mean, our lives are always characterized by sort of layers of an onion, things that are more that are more global, things that are more public, things that are things that are entirely private, and things that are in between. And we've lost that in between layer. We're all just like we've gotten into a world where we're all individuals trying to surf the unsurfable huge wave of the global and the universal. Mm-hmm. And we need to use all the tools at our disposal to recreate the connective tissue.
ReFi summer has arrived, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer 1 blockchain for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed towards producing a sustainable future from the very beginning, and is the world's first carbon-negative, EVM-compatible layer 1 blockchain. CELO has become much more than a technology, a currency, a community, or even just a layer 1. CELO is a movement to create conditions of prosperity for everyone. You can soon engage with all of this via green asset Uniswap pools on CELO, benefiting reforestation and other regenerative products through the Toucan protocol, Moss, and more. ReFi is also about the health of communities, and Resource Network is creating bankless infrastructure for circular trade and mutual credit networks to benefit small businesses and local economies, all on CELO. Follow along on Twitter to learn more about how CELO is accelerating ReFi summer for a positive impact on people, communities, and the planet. If you're attending ECC, visit the CELO Saloon to learn about what's happening on the front lines of ReFi from industry experts. The Opera crypto browser is the world's first web browser built for the crypto community. With Web3 support and a non-custodial wallet, Opera lets you access DeFi apps quickly and easily. The Opera wallet has buy, sell, and swap features, and of course lets you view your beautiful NFTs, but the browser still lets you use any crypto wallet extension you prefer, giving you the choice and flexibility for the Web3 world. Opera lets you view and manage all of your assets across all the blockchains all at once, and offers seamless multi-chain support between Ethereum, Bitcoin, Polygon, Binance Chain, and other EVMs and layer 2s. But Opera goes even deeper than that. Opera has a built-in homepage for crypto natives with the Opera Crypto Corner, with price charts, news feeds, NFT updates to make sure you are always on top of your game. And it even has Discord and Telegram integrated natively into the browser. That's crazy. Opera is truly building the battle station for the crypto world. Check out Opera both on mobile with Android and iOS apps, and on desktop too.
I feel like I'm leaving this episode so open-ended, and it's because you have such a depth of ideas about mechanism design and this space, and I'm kind of hoping that you're going to lead us through it a little bit. So I'm sorry, I'm just asking totally open-ended questions here, but yes, let's switch over to Harbinger taxes, and I want to know how those sort of support the world that we want to build as well.
Where to begin here? Let me explain some of the background ideas first, and then I'll kind of get into like mechanism design stuff about how to instantiate these sorts of values. So I think that a good point of entry for this idea is to think about land, to think about the value of land and like private property in land. The way that if you think about just land, so leave aside structures and improvements and that, and all that kind of infrastructure and all that kind of stuff for a moment here. Just think about land. The way that unimproved land becomes valuable, the way that it gets more valuable over time, is basically by virtue of the network effect of people on it and near it interacting and generating a society, right? So if I have like if Manhattan Island was empty and I owned a piece of land on Manhattan Island, it would be worth way less than it's worth now. And the reason for that is not that there's anything, not that it's more arable or that the river is whatever. It's the reason Manhattan land is worth a gajillion dollars instead of a few dollars is that there are tons and tons and tons of people around every piece of land on Manhattan, or interacting in this rich interconnected society, creating culture and doing economic exchange and all of the amazing, beautiful things that people do. And so with the consequence of that, like the sort of troubling insight that leads to, which was first really clearly articulated by a 19th century economist named Henry George, is the idea that that the owner of a particular piece of land is not responsible for most of the value of that land, right? It's not that now if you build a building on a piece of land, then you add a lot of value to the land. But if we just control for the building, there are massive variations in land value that are only attributable to these like network effects of people interacting, which has nothing to do with anything that the owner of any piece of land did. This is a funny thing. Right. This is a serious problem. This is essentially like a very, very serious problem with the way that private property works, and therefore with one of the most important institutions in our society.
Yeah, totally. And I just I've never heard you articulate this before, but it just makes so much sense. I mean, you've got sort of like public action and public network effects, and you've got privatized gains for whoever owns that land. It kind of reminds me of our internet culture, where you've got these kind of tech giants that have these network effect based business models, and that's how they create exponential growth. I know you wanted to stay focused on land, so maybe we'll stay there, but it did remind me of that a little bit.
No, that's exactly the right connection to make. I mean, this pattern of sort of basically strong private property interests allowing owners or speculators or whatever to capture value created by networks that they didn't build, basically. That pattern runs throughout our society, and it's something people don't like to look at. It's a huge problem, and it's a problem of justice. It means that the gains from economic development and technological development are too concentrated and are falling into the wrong hands. And it's an efficiency problem, because it means that the people who are creating value in society, who are living their lives and building businesses and creating art and whatever, making Manhattan awesome, and or making a social network vibrant or whatever, people who are participating in these networks, they're not getting, they're creating value that doesn't end up empowering them, that ends up empowering other people. Now, so it's a justice problem. It's also an efficiency problem, because if you could fix that, if you could basically kind of redirect the stream of value creation back into the pockets and back into the people who are interacting and creating society, they would be not only better off, but also better incentivized to continue their pro-social ways, right? To continue to create art and continue to participate in society and continue to engage with their neighbors in a productive, beneficial way, right? So kind of, you can see like resonances here with the whole sort of NIMBY thing, right? There's like, there are incentives that aren't there for people to be like good neighbors and productive members of communities, that it would be cool if they were there, in addition to being more fair. So like that's like that in the context not only of land, but also in the context of, as you're saying, digital networks and really anything. That's the problem that SALSA, Harberger Taxes, partial common ownership, the thing with many names that I'm about to describe tries to address. So I'll want to pause a beat there to give you a chance to stop me, or I'll just roll into a description.
Yeah, I'm ready to roll. Let's get into Harberger Taxes. Let's hear about it.
Okay, so picture this, and let's stay in the context of land, even though this does not have to apply to land. It's just a way of sort of making it concrete so that you can think about the structure. Imagine you own a piece of land, or sorry, let me rewind and not use the word own, because what this is essentially a way of rethinking ownership. Imagine if you possess a piece of land, and in order to, and there's like basically sort of like a property tax on your possession of land. So in order to continue to possess the land, you need to pay the community something. This is an acknowledgement of what I was just talking about, right? This is an acknowledgement of the fact that, private exclusive possession of something like this is essentially, it imposes a negative externality on the network that gives the thing value. It enables you, your private possession of a piece of land enables you to exclude other people from the land, and that's why property taxes, that's the idea of what property taxes are trying to sort of deal with. So you possess a piece of land, you have to pay a property tax on it. Property tax is calculated as some percentage of the value. Now imagine if instead of some assessor using some formula and saying what they think the land is worth, you self-assess the land. So you basically self-declare, I think that my continued possession of this land is worth $100. Then your property tax is then calculated as some percentage of that self-declared value. Now, the obvious issue with this is that then everybody has incentive to underdeclare the value. So imagine the following sort of twist in our institution design here. Whatever you self-declare the land to be worth is also a declaration of what you would be willing to sell it for. So if you say $100, then if somebody comes to you with $100, you have to sell it. It's like a sell offer as well as a assessment. And so what that does is that gives you an incentive to not lowball it, but to to declare a high value so that you can continue to possess it if indeed you want to continue to possess your interest. Now there's another sort of layer to this, which is then the question of how do you sort of set the right tax here. So if you imagine a tax rate that's very, very low. Imagine that the property tax rate here is 0.0000001%, right? Then no matter what I actually think my land is worth, I'm going to declare a super high value, and just pay a really low tax and continue to possess it. Similarly, if the property tax is really high, if the property tax is 100%, then I'm not even going to want to possess it. I'm going to declare a low value and just let somebody else have it and get it off my hands. So the question in this sort of mechanism design, institutional design problem is, how do you sort of set that tax rate at a level where people will honestly self-report what the possession of the land is worth to them? And if you can do that, if you can strike that balance so that these self-assessments are essentially honest self-reportings of what possession is worth to a particular person, then you can you're doing a few interesting things. First of all, you are ensuring that the most efficient possessor of any particular asset is going to be in possession of that particular asset at any given time. And second, you're going to maximize the tax revenue. And I'm calling this tax revenue, but it doesn't have to be like a government tax. You could just think of this as like a fee in a sort of a private institutional design, setup. And that's cool. Maximizing that tax revenue is cool, because what do you do with that? The idea would be that you take that tax revenue and recycle it back into the network of people who are creating the value of the underlying asset. So in the case of a piece of land in Manhattan, the network of people creating the value of that asset are people who live, work, play, travel to, interact with the vibrant society of Manhattan. So take that tax revenue and use it to make people's lives better, create public goods, build more infrastructure, egalitarianly support the whole social structure. And so what this is a shift of mentality away from a traditional private property mentality, right? The idea, this is a way of understanding something like land or some other kind of exclusive possession of a digital social network or whatever. It's a way of reconceptualizing exclusive possession of those kinds of things as like the stewardship of something on behalf of a community, but which nonetheless leverages the power of markets and distributed intelligence to do it efficiently, right? And to kind of have an efficient owner of any particular asset there, and you can sort of tweak the dials here to ensure that investment in assets is incentivized at the right level, and so this is kind of a pattern, an institutional design pattern that lets us think about power sharing in a deeper and more powerful way than the kind of absolute medieval I own this plot, you own that plot mentality that we've inherited from hundreds, thousands of years ago.
Right. What I think is so elegant about this mechanism is how it uses markets and collective intelligence to balance both sides of the equation. So you've basically got the ability for a market to take any specific piece of property at a certain price, which incentivizes the owner not to price it too low. And then you've got the sort of like taxes, which incentivizes the owner not to price it so high. And it just seems like such an elegant mechanism that doesn't have any sort of, it seems like, bureaucrat on, like assessing your property tax, or it's leveraging markets, and it's leveraging the people that are closest to the system in order to balance it. And I think that's one of the most elegant things about it. I'm wondering, are there any examples of this being implemented, and how is it going? What is the future of experimentation with this mechanism?
Yeah, so there's a group, Matters Labs, which is doing an experiment called the Space right now, which is a very cool and high profile experiment with SALSA mechanisms, where it's a bit like a pixel map, where you can people can purchase essentially purchase different parts of a pixel map, and collaboratively create an image, which you could think of as an analogy for collaboratively creating a society through land flowing to different owners and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Some other really interesting examples are using it for advertising space, and I'm also quite interested in the idea of using it for art. So just to give a sort of a quick flavor of what these are, and there has been experimentation in both these areas as well. Advertising is like, you can kind of think of advertising as third parties unilaterally staking claims to our attention, or whatever, right? And by kind of claiming that space in our attentional bandwidth, they're imposing negative externalities on the network of people around them, a little bit like private land ownership. So you could think of a mechanism like SALSA might be a much more efficient way of allocating possession of internet ads or billboards, or whatever it may be. There's also interesting applications in art. So, for example, one big problem with art is that I make a great painting, I sell it to a smart kind of like early stage collector. They sell it to one other person. A few years later, it sells for a good $1 jillion, and I only got the $300 that my friend paid to me for it.
Right.
That problem is a function of this kind of outdated absolutist conception of ownership. That SALSA allows us to create to tweak the dials of asset possession in ways that would enable creators to have a stake in those ongoing movements of value. There's really like no limit to this. I mean, I could basically, like, you name the sort of area of like asset structuring, and I can give you an interesting application for SALSA. I mean, natural resources are another one. But one thing I'm really excited about right now is basically the ecosystem of blockchain based digital assets, like non-fungible tokens, right, that are structured using Harberger taxation or SALSA, partial common ownership, is really, really developing. So I think that we're going to see a lot of interesting structuring of digital assets using this mechanism in the coming years. And that excites me in and of itself. It also excites me because I think it's going to open a lot of people's minds to the idea that a different way of thinking about ownership might be better than the familiar way of thinking about it that we were taught as children.
Yeah, nothing like seeing something in practice, I think, to really get an idea planted in your mind. And I think that smart contracts and Web3 and NFTs are kind of the perfect place to be experimenting with some of these mechanisms. Smart contracts can manage the setting of the price of an asset and the purchase of an asset and the implementation of the payment of the creator of the artwork. So it just seems like a very elegant, efficient place to be experimenting with Harberger Taxes. So yeah, curious to see what experiments develop over the next couple of years.
And one more, can I give you one more? I'm excited about seeing this asset structure used in the context of local governance and or like community currencies and stuff like that. So you could imagine a community currency in which the community of people using the currency has assembled a trust of shared assets, and then they basically use the community currency to divide the possession of those shared assets between themselves, under this sort of SALSA system. So now you can start to imagine like a community of people with its own currency. You need to have some of that currency to get possessory interests in the shared assets of the community. And those shared assets in the community are being managed using SALSA or Harberger taxation. So they're being managed very efficiently. They're generating a stream of sort of a maximized stream of income, which is then being recycled into the whole community, whether or not you have purchased possessory rights in those assets. So yeah, it's and you could also even imagine city governments doing this, right? You could imagine city governments accruing portfolios of let's say commercial real estate in their own cities, and allocating it through SALSA, and they could manage it in something like an urban wealth fund, for example, right? That would hold these assets, manage them using a sufficient system, generate a stream of income that would be used to fund public goods in the city, or even just directly compensate people in the city through some kind of UBI like thing. I think it's easy to get that wrong, but it's also it's a useful pattern to have in mind as a way that this sort of thing could be redistributed. So yeah, I mean, I think this is very unfamiliar. Like the sort of patterns of thinking about ownership that this interacts with are strong and persistent, which makes it hard. Right. But I have very little doubt that this way of thinking about asset sharing and asset possession is going to play an important part in the next decade of technology and society in general.
Yeah. Very cool. I think that we're over time. I was just messaging you that I think we only have a couple more minutes, so I think it's good time to start zooming back out and talking about the ecosystem that y'all are building. I'm curious if but before we do that, I'm curious if there's anything that I didn't ask you that you want to say, Matt.
No, let's start zooming out.
Okay. Great. Well, how do people get involved in the movement? Say you're a smart contract developer, say you're working on DeFi and you want to get involved in building some of these mechanisms associated with RadicalxChange. What's the best way to get involved?
One good way of getting involved is to shoot an email to chapters@radicalxchange.org, and we will do our best to plug you into the network. So there's lots of smart and interesting people around the world who are thinking about these things and looking for ways, looking for other bright people to collaborate with on projects, or looking for opportunities to try experiments. And we view it as core to our mission to help build those connections. Like we really have basically the RadicalxChange resource is a really a rich network that anyone can get involved with. So email us at chapters@radicalxchange.org. Also sign up for our newsletter and join our community calls. We do a community call first Wednesday of each month, which is open and a good way to kind of put some faces to names, get to know some other people who are spending a lot of time on this work. And yeah, I mean, our entire philosophy is essentially to create network effects, create gains that we're not capturing, and help, give opportunities to others who want to contribute. So open door.
Yeah. Amazing. And I can attest to the quality of the Radical Exchange movement and network. I've been to a couple of y'all's events, the one in Detroit, the one in Denver. Selfishly, I hope you come back to Colorado soon. And I think Gitcoin in many ways is built on top of a lot of these ideas, and also looking to help other entrepreneurs and people who want to build meaningful stuff for the world build on top of your ideas. So big fan, Matt, and looking forward to working together in the future. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great work that you have done and all the great work you're going to continue to do.
Yeah, likewise.